Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation? The podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Ravi Kurani. Ravi Kurani is the founder of Sutro, a water testing and data analytics company he founded in 2013. The company's main product is a built-in sensor-connected app that monitors the health of your swimming pool and notifies you if maintenance is required and also orders pool supplies. Ravi was selected to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in 2017 for the energy category. He attended the University of California, Riverside, where he graduated with a BS in mechanical engineering and earned his MBA from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies and a certificate in sustainable energy conversion and storage from Stanford University. Ravi, I am so excited to have you on the show today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you for having me, Jared.
Yeah. Well, let's dive right in. What, in your mind, is innovation?
Innovation is solving problems. If I was to kind of unpack that a little bit, I use those words particularly because people sometimes think it's just building solutions, right? The main point here is that you want to make sure that what you are building a solution for is a core problem and you've really identified that. And that's kind of why I say innovation is solving problems.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Now, what's the difference between, and you kind of mentioned it there, but the difference between solving a problem and building a solution?
Yeah, there's kind of this common mentality with founders, entrepreneurs, even people, intrapreneurs in the market of if you build it, they'll come.
Yes.
And it doesn't work that way. You can't just sit in an ivory tower and make something and hope that it'll come. And that's kind of definitionally why I say innovation is solving a problem.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that there's not ingenuity or there's not any sort of engineering behind or science behind making a solution. That could be very interesting, right? You can make a great app, you can make a great piece of technology, but if nobody's going to use it, I don't really think it's innovation because you're not really solving a problem.
I see. And that definition, I like the distinction between sort of the technology or the enabler piece. You might do something new and different in how you bring it to life, but if it doesn't solve a problem, it's not innovation. How does having that sort of teased apart create value? Why is that distinction needed?
Yeah, and I think if you double click into this definition of value, the way that I would talk about it in this particular context is people, right? Humans have problems. And a problem can range all the way from having nice shoes, where you might buy a Gucci bag or some Nikes, all the way to, I need a quicker way to make coffee, right? I want a Keurig. Is there a Keurig in every home? No. Does every single person have a Gucci bag? No. I think problems in that sense are different, but people buy things to solve a particular issue that they have. And when you kind of start pushing the boundary or you start, talking about innovation around branding, innovation around, more comfortable shoes, innovation around how to make coffee quicker, those are all solutions that solve a particular problem. And so that's kind of, to your question, I think people will have problems and the solutions then solve those problems.
I see. And as people, and I know you're a founder and you're familiar with the sort of entrepreneurial lens often placed on innovation, what I'm hearing is that it's important to understand the difference between a new technology or a new solution and actual innovation, because it's important to stay connected to the value that it creates.
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. Which is why an investor will ask you, what's the value proposition? Right? And those words, value proposition, if you deconstruct that, value for who, right? What is the value for? They'll always say, well, I'm selling to this demographic. I'm selling to this person, this style of person. And that's why my value proposition is XYZ for this particular person. That's, I think, deconstructing that word value proposition is kind of where that comes from.
Got it. So if I'm a person with a great sort of marketing position-driven idea, I might need to, and I'm trying to think about innovation, I might need to balance that with a unique solution. So I might know someone that has a problem, but I need a unique solution. Whereas if I've come up with a new technology or a new app or a new way of doing things, a new how, I need to make sure I balance it with finding someone who actually has a problem that solves.
Entirely, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, if you do approach it from the solution side, you can kind of, in a sense, almost table that solution. Mm-hmm. You'll end up with a hypothesis of what you think that solution solves, right? What problem that solution solves and for who. Mm-hmm. And at that point in time, you definitely need to go back to the drawing board again and find a handful of those people to question them, right? I think to kind of give a core example of this, right? My company, Sutro, we make a robotics device that measures water chemistry. Mm. Water chemistry is important across the board, but our product, if you go to our website today, is a swimming pool, hot tub, and jacuzzi monitor.
Okay.
Water's water. Water's everywhere. I could have tackled 1,000 different markets, but we went in the pool and spa industry. The kind of background there, right? For those people that own pool or spas, you've probably seen people dipping that little test kit inside and looking at the color. Mm-hmm. There's a problem that exists. People need to measure water chemistry, whether or not we exist, to make sure their pool is clean to swim in. Now, do we have a better mousetrap? 100%, right? But are we changing the inherent blueprint or infrastructure of what people are doing? Not really. We're testing the water as they would be testing them. We're testing it more accurately. We're testing it better. We're testing it quicker. We have data analysis on the app. But the inherent basis, the first principles of the product are you need to measure water chemistry so you can make sure your pool's safe to swim in. Mm. And we solve that problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Talk to me about the journey of going from we can test water purity and water cleanliness is important, mm-hmm. down to let's create a product that serves this demographic.
Yeah, funny story, actually. So I was an associate at a small venture capital fund in India. And a lot of the deals that we had coming through were water-related deals, right? Water is a big problem in India.
Right.
We saw a lot of water filtration deals. People were saying, hey, we have a jack or Jane of all trades that's ways to purify water. And when we kind of went deeper into that question and we started questioning the founders and looked at the market, we very quickly realized that water was different for each application it's being used for, right? So you put chlorine in water in your pool water, but you probably don't want to use that chlorinated water to water your plants.
Right.
You put fertilizer in your plant water, but you probably don't want to take a glass of water and drink that water you're using to plant your plants, right? So what you do to the water actually is different for each of the applications you have. And so we kind of switched to the sensor market. We were like, hey, your filter is really cool and all, but do you know what your filter is being used for and what the application is?
Oh, right.
And so that's kind of initially where we went into the sensing side, and we built a prototype, tried selling it to the Indian government. Stupidest thing a startup can do. Don't try to sell to a government. They're riddled in red tape. You're gonna die by the time you even get the fundraising in order to do that. And so we came back and I flipped the model around. My dad used to have a chain of pool and spa supply stores, and I'm like, hey, why don't we repurpose the sensor for a very different market, sell them to wealthier pool owners, get the capital in, and then reinvest it into this drinking water stuff later. So that's the long and short story of it.
No, that is brilliant. And it underscores every point you're making here around solving problems versus building solutions. It really takes that kind of dedicated focus on who has the problem and what, from a first principle standpoint, what does it really take to solve it? Because you could have easily over-engineered something to solve that problem.
Exactly. And I could have sat in a lab in a basement all day long for the next 3 years in India developing this thing.
Right.
To very quickly realize, hey, the Indian government's not going to buy it, right? And so you kind of got to get out there and test this. This is why I say innovation solving a problem, because the problem wasn't large enough, or I didn't have enough bandwidth to wait for that problem to become large enough for me to solve it for the Indian government. And therefore I need to pivot, right? That's why they call it a pivot, to move to a different area to potentially use this solution for another market segment. And maybe it turns out there actually is none, right? Or maybe there's a tangential market where it could be used for like wine manufacturing or something. Like, who knows, right? And that's kind of where this exploratory side of finding problems and building solutions for them comes in.
Right. It also underscores the importance of defining the problem from the consumer or customer's point of view and not from your own point of view. Because you're an expert, because you spend so much time in the space, it's easy to see a problem that other people don't see yet, and then build a solution for that problem, but then there's no market for it because the average person doesn't see it yet.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's actually really funny. I see this with a few founders that I mentor. They have this, it's my baby mentality.
Mm-hmm.
And that very quickly starts rolling into multiple layers of protection where they're not willing to give equity to people because they're scared that other people are going to come in, or they don't want to break out of this mold because they feel that, hey, this is the thing that I made and people need to buy it. Well, it's like, you can't force people to buy it if they don't want it. At some point in time, it's like, it could be as much of your baby as it is, but you need to get out there and execute.
Yeah.
And that goes back into problem finding and making sure your solution fits that messaging and storytelling around what that problem is.
Right. And sometimes there's no amount of articulation that can make a problem relevant to enough people to make it viable as a proposition and as a true innovation to enter the market. Everyone can be right. That's the part that I think is hard for folks to digest sometimes, is you're not wrong. You may be early, you may be in the wrong place.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you're wrong, but it also doesn't mean that you are owed revenue.
Entirely. Yeah. At this time and moment.
At this point. That's right.
I think you raise a really good point of like, you could be early, right? Like, for example, Webvan is a really good example of this. They were basically Instacart back in the 2000s, right? During the dot-com bubble.
Oh, wow.
We use Instacart and DoorDash and all that stuff today, right? But we use it now today because we are primed to use our phones to communicate and order things and order Ubers. We have the general priming and massaging to understand that this is how the technology works.
Right.
I don't know if I necessarily want to go on webvan.com in the 2000s when I had an AOL dial-up connection.
Right.
And I'm sitting here trying to order groceries, right? Like I wasn't in the mindset at that point in time to understand that business model.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, entirely. Your point's correct there. This may just not be the right time.
That's such a great example. Such a great example. And there are probably ideas now, concepts now that are struggling with that. And it takes a fair amount of humility, I think, to be able to see that and then operate differently. To say, you know what, I'm right. There's something here. I'm not wrong. And it's not the right thing to do right now.
Entirely. And I think your word choice of humility, and I would probably add ego, right? Alongside with that is a big determiner of whether somebody's going to be successful or not. Mostly because you have to learn how to, there's this concept of like unattachment, right? Or disattachment to the idea in itself. I know this is getting like a little philosophical, but it kind of requires you to be correct and be right when you're what I call in the room. And when you get out of the room, you have to be very comfortable with being wrong. And you have to be very comfortable with kind of giving and being just generally gracious with your time and with listening. I like to say you keep your mouth on when you're inside and you turn your ears on when you go out.
That's a great way of thinking about it. Yeah.
And so you might have this idea, right? We had the Sutro idea, this water sanitation idea when we were in the building. We had a great product, the thing worked, but when we got out of the building, nobody wanted to buy it. And you can keep pounding the pavement at some point in time, but at some rate, you're just going to say, okay, enough is enough. I need to go back to the drawing board again and pivot the product, pivot the problem, pivot the solution. And then you're always turning on and off these knobs when you go back inside. And then when you go back outside, you just need to go back to listening again.
Well said. That's a great visual, in the room, out of the room. I think it's a great mental model to wrap that around. So as we've unpacked innovation as a way of solving problems and some of the sort of pitfalls that can derail you or complicate things, I'm going to dive more specifically into what isn't innovation in your mind.
Yeah, so what isn't innovation? I think I pull back to one of the first things that I said of when you build it, they'll come, right? I think that's what innovation is not. We get a lot of founders that on a technology side, right? They'll sit all day long and they'll focus on cost reduction, for example. I was working with a founder that was building a piece of hardware and he was like, we have to get costs down. We have to get costs down. And my question to him was like, how many have you deployed?
Right.
A cost exercise, I'm not saying that you shouldn't focus on profitability. I'm just saying your goal right now is to validate whether or not this is a problem. And people generally are going to buy it at what you think a respectable hypothesized cost would be.
Right.
But he was in the building, right, all day long, focusing on how he can shave off a penny here and a penny there. And ended up saving, $10, which makes a very big difference when you're making 10,000 units.
Yeah.
But when you're making 5, you're $50, you got to get the product out there because you're wasting $50 by not getting out there by another day of your time.
Right.
Than you staying in the building, right? And so that's kind of one case. There was another example of a founder I was mentoring that got so caught up on like the equity of his company. And he's like, oh, this guy owns a percentage and this guy owns a percentage and I need to buy that back and buy that. And I'm like, your mental capacity, you only have so many hours a day to focus on so many problems.
Yes.
If your brain is churning about how many points you're given here or there, this goes back to like disattachment again, right? Or kind of unattachment. Whatever's happened. You gave those points when you gave those points. Your goal now is to grow the valuation of the company to get to the next stage so that rising tides raise all ships, help everybody out. That's the whole point of this, so we can all grow together.
Yes.
But if you're trying to be this isolated founder that's worried about a penny here and a penny there and your percentage point here and a percentage there, then probably just shouldn't start a company, right? Then go and do your own thing and, don't let other people in the room then.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It kind of baffled me of like how much his mental energy was consumed by these problems when I'm like, I would just put that aside and be like, my mind is fresh to work on these things I need to actually accomplish and execute.
Right.
So I can get that done 1 hour quicker and go to bed earlier versus staying up until whatever time because my mind's now filled with all this stuff.
Yeah. It's easy for both sides of the fence, the sort of VC-driven side, the bootstrap side. It's easy to lose track as an entrepreneur of what the advantages are of your capital setup. And if you forget that, you don't reap the benefits of it. So the benefit is I've got capital to be able to do these things to focus my time on solving the problem.
Exactly. And you need to kind of figure out what is your real value you derive, right? Because the capital is nothing but an enabler.
Yep.
It's a mechanism to get you from A to B to C.
Right.
But if you're too busy at B, worried about all the things you made at A, you're never going to get to C because you're looking backwards the entire time. Right.
And the person who is bootstrapping it in their garage has the sort of opposite problem. They're trying to figure out how to find that next dollar or figuring out how to compromise the approach or compromise the solution to accommodate the limited funds or the capital constrained approach they're taking.
Exactly. Yeah.
And both, if you don't recognize, oh, I'm bootstrapping this and that gives me the opportunity to think differently or move faster or what have you, or I'm VC backed, and that means I can build a staff and operate with scale much more quickly. I think that's where you have to be in either configuration. But if you're focused on the drawback, then your point of capital as an enabler is lost on either side.
Exactly. 100%. Yeah.
Yeah. You do a lot of mentorship. I know you've got a background in capital and founder and all those things. Talk to me about this sort of energy investment. You said you were getting a little philosophical, but I do want to talk about how do you manage your energy? Frankly, what I find is that mentoring and mentorship and supporting people can be as draining as running your own business if you're not careful, because for different reasons. So how do you balance that?
If I kind of take a few steps back, there's this beautiful book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb called The Black Swan. And in a very simple, I'm going to try not butcher this because he's done an amazing job of writing this book, but basically there are events that are out of your control that will dictate the outcome of your company, of your life, of whatever that might be, right? There could be an earthquake. There could be the pandemic. There could be World War II. These things happen that ended up changing society. And I had friends that actually were starting restaurants right before the pandemic. And within the course of 2 months, all the doors were shuttered, right? There was no restaurant business. I mean, DoorDash went crazy because people were sitting at home and they needed the delivery service. But the restaurants themselves, if they didn't pivot quick enough, ended up closing.
Yes.
Right. And so it's kind of like events like that. There's no planning for those things, which is kind of why I bring up this concept of unattachment many times. If you combine the Black Swan philosophy with unattachment, you just want to make sure that you, build robustness in your situation, whether that be your company, your organization, your life. Build robustness and build redundancy. And that could be just in making sure that you have enough processes and you can move agile enough to pivot, right? For example, we were going to go to pool stores when we first started launching Sutro. That got closed. We launched right 2 months before the pandemic started as well. And we had to move entirely online. We hadn't built a 3PL. We hadn't built our website, but you just do that because you're like, well, now I guess the reality is we're all going to move online. And it was great. It took us time. You know, we worked a few hours over, but it turned out to be extremely positive. So going back to that black swan philosophy, plus this unattachment side of things, that's kind of honestly how I get energy, is knowing that those two philosophies combined. You can use the headline of Stoicism, people like Marcus Aurelius Meditations, all in the same sphere of kind of thinking. But it's just going back to that founder that was worried about his equity. You have to release and kind of give up to like some point, because your mind needs to have the focus and the energy to focus on the next thing. And if you're too busy worried about the energy you put in decisions you've already made, then you're always going to be in feedback loops that's continuously driving you backwards instead of moving forwards.
Right.
And then you're not agile enough. Your focus is so small because you're looking at all these other decisions. You don't get to open up wide to see, oh, well, COVID's happening over here. I need to make sure I can jump because that looks like it's a train that's coming this way.
Right.
And if we make a decision and COVID ended up being something completely different, well, then we have an online store now, right? Great. We were going to be in person and online. So be it. We're going to move forward on step 3 now. And so to your question of energy, right? That's kind of where I get the energy from, is robustness, redundancy, unattachment, looking forward. And 2 other things that are very tactical are honestly getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night, putting my phone away, making sure I don't eat 3 hours before I actually hit the bed, and then actually meditating. So I meditate for 30 minutes every morning. That's kind of how I stay focused.
That's all great stuff. Whenever I talk with someone and learn from them in conversations, it seems like there's always something where you're speaking specifically to me. And that was just for me. Get more sleep and get back to my meditation practice. So thank you for that. Energy management is so important. Whether you're an entrepreneur thinking about innovation, whether you're an entrepreneur inside a big company thinking about how to drive innovation, because it requires change. And change requires, I'm a chemical engineer, and I think about entropy and heat and motion and all those things. They require energy to get started. And as innovators, I think that's something that can be underestimated. And so as I was listening to you unpack kind of all the different angles that you've attacked this from and the different ways you've pivoted, those pivots, they require energy. And so it really got me curious about how you manage it, having pivoted so many different ways, worked in so many different countries and municipalities and regions and things. It's all different. If you have a more of an attached mindset, it's easy to kind of hang on to what I learned, what I did, the energy I put into this construct, and bring that with you into the next construct, and it becomes baggage if it's not properly managed.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you can also just say the only time is now, is the present, right? As humans, we don't live in the future or the past. We've made decisions in the past. We can learn from those.
Yeah.
But at some point in time, the here and now is all you really have available to you, right? That's kind of all you generally have. And so that kind of goes back to that disattachment or unattachment.
And it probably informs your view of risk, I would imagine.
Yeah, very much so, right? I think risk in general is a measure of predictability, right? And your predictability of moving into the future. If you go with the black swan theory, then in a sense, you have small bouts of predictability, right? Generally, the world is predictable in small chunks, but en masse, these big events end up changing the direction of history, of business, of economics, of countries, way more than any of these smaller things. It's kind of funny because every time you see the news headline, you're like, the biggest flood that we've ever seen, the biggest economic event in the last 10 years. Well, we've had 10 large economic events in the last 10 years. Like at some point in time, when is the next largest one going to be, right? And I think that's kind of lends itself to this black swan theory. And so you're right. There is a management of risk, but making sure that you basically bring enough energy to not stay focused on the stuff in the past so you can leave your blinders wide gives you enough ability to see the risks as they're coming at you, which then does build that kind of redundancy as well, right? You don't ever want to get caught short-footed, which means that in the smaller chunks of where there is predictability, you build systems on much smaller iterative loops, which allow you to actually plan for a lot more, right? Because you're iterating and adjusting very quote unquote quickly because it's in smaller chunks versus you having a 5 or a 10-year plan.
Right.
If you look back, how many of your 5 or 10-year plans ever really shook out, right? They don't.
No.
Plans within months and within quarters, within a given year generally will. And so if you just historically look back and look at your own life that way, it only lends itself that the smaller iterative loops of compounding, doing the same thing every day, being consistent, being robust, gives you a higher upswing than making a 5-year plan and saying, hey, these are my 5-year, resolutions. It's like, well, it may or may not happen, and 9 times out of 10, it probably doesn't happen.
Right. And that doesn't mean you're any better or worse off, right? I mean, it just means that the world is not predictable on that scale.
Exactly.
I think that's such an important point as we talk about innovation, because as a founder, you're trying to raise funds. What's one of the first things that you're taught to put together is a projection of revenue over some unknowable period of time. And as you talked about, displaying that confidence, but still also being naive, maintaining your naivete and your understanding that the world is only predictable in these small iterative chunks as you go back to go to work. So it really, I think, does kind of contribute to your understanding and your definition of risk, contributes to your understanding and definition of innovation as a process, because innovation as a mindset, but innovation as a process for accomplishing things, I think it only exists inside of a person's definition of risk.
Yeah, entirely. And I think if you take the 2 or 3 things I said over the last few minutes we've been talking, you start off with innovation as solving a problem, right? With my very first statement I said.
Yep.
And then you combine that with risk and this disattachment philosophy, combined with smaller iterative loops, allows you to go out into the market and continuously keep mirroring and echoing off of the people you're selling to, your customers, your other organizations. And as the world changes, right? As Steve Jobs launches the iPhone, as there is an app store, as 3G, 4G, 5G comes along, as ChatGPT and OpenAI come along, these are technological changes, right? Within my business and my frame that I'm talking of this with,
Sure.
that make a direct impact as to how we do work. And so if I would have, for example, chosen SQL as a back-end language, right, which is a database language, that very much is coming out of date. Like I think with OpenAI, we're going to very quickly see, I mean, there are other, I don't want to get into the technical side of things, but part of this risk acceptance allows, if you keep your blinders open, allows you to see the ChatGPTs and the OpenAIs. It maybe allows us to find a new language to develop apps on so we can be on both Google and iOS quicker.
Right, I see.
If you're so stuck on your one way of like, we're only going to use this language and we have to be in Swift because iOS uses that, well, React Native might be a better way of doing it, right? And I don't want to go too over and above for the audience out there.
No.
But there's also technological risk, there's people risk, there's market risk. And the smaller iterative loops, if you just keep your eyes open, there's these black swans happening everywhere. And if you see them and just kind of make sure that you're robust enough, you'll eventually make a bunch of small pivots that end up turning into a much more robust, larger system.
I see. So it really takes risk, and I think when a lot of people hear risk, they think threat. But what I'm hearing from you is risk more in the framework of uncertainty.
Yes.
Which then allows you to be still optimistic and opportunistic in that frame and not go right from risk to threat to how do I avoid to how do I prevent. It's more like risk to uncertainty to where do the opportunities lie to how can I be different going forward.
Exactly.
Got it.
That's kind of very similar to the way that we look at science, right? There's unknown unknowns, things that you just don't know that you don't know.
Yep.
And then you know that you don't know them, and then you know that you know them, right? So as you're kind of evolving across that spectrum iteratively, very, very quickly on a day-by-day basis, week by week, month by month, you end up just like an RPG game, right? If you're playing Halo or one of those, like you have to explore the map.
Right.
And if you drop into a spot and you just stay there, your worldview, your radius is only as big as you can see. And that's kind of how I would explain it.
That's great stuff. Before I let you go, I definitely want you to share any advice, any specific advice. You've shared lots of nuggets that I've taken away from this personally. Any specific advice you'd have for innovators?
I would definitely read The Black Swan. I think it has infused and has changed my thinking on risk management, innovation. I would definitely read the Lean Startup on the other side, Eric Ries. That was the problem solution stuff that I'm talking about. I do have to give credit to the Lean Startup. That's kind of where I learned that. Those two books, honestly, if innovators want tactical advice, read those two books. And then from the philosophical side, definitely work on your unattachment. Like you said, think about how much energy you're putting into a particular thought, if it's around the equity side or if it's around you sitting in the building, right? Whatever that might be. And then the third piece is I would get enough sleep and I would meditate. Those are kind of the 5 points I would say for any innovators out there.
Great stuff, Ravi. So helpful, thoughtful. I love that the conversation was philosophical, but also grounded in sort of tactical examples and actionable things. So I really appreciate the breadth and depth of the conversation. Ravi Kurani, innovation is solving problems, not necessarily just building solutions. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Jared. Thanks again for having me.
All right. Take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at OutlastLLC, OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.